Hello, welcome back to Crushing Comics, the show where I fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. Let's go straight to the wall. Ooh, and pick out the one we're going to open today. Let's talk for a second about the new year. Do you remember when you were in like grade school and it would be a new year and it would be really hard to remember to write the date the right way? Whenever I'm having an experience with my daughter around the passage of time, I always think about that because I remember it being like third grade and needing to write the new date and just being like physically incapable of getting the year right for months. Like it would take me until March to have reminders from my teacher of what the year was for me to get it right as a date, as like on our worksheets and stuff. And I often think about that wasn't just like a quirk of me as an individual kid, but when you're a kid, like your whole writing dates on paper's life consists of first grade. And then to change that habit feels unreal when you get to, you know, the midpoint of first grade and then into second grade. And then it feels unreal again in third grade. And I feel like it takes a while before your brain really realizes like, wow, this is something that's going to keep changing. I'm going to have to keep adapting through my whole life. And that's not to say there's people that don't have trouble remembering the date forever, even now in the realm of having it right on your cell phone or right on the sidebar of your computer screen. But I think about that when I'm asking my daughter like to try something or how long something felt or when something changes that's a habit for her. And I think like, well, her whole life she's been doing this thing this way, or even like a month of her life still constitutes like, you know, 2% of her life. And it's a while before a month doesn't seem like a really long time. Like if you tell me your books are going to get there in a month, I'm like, all right, well, that's not so bad. I can think of something to do for a month. You tell my daughter something's going to happen in a month, she's like, a month? Really? So that I always think about that and think about that change as it relates to a new year. Let's see what we've got in here. Ooh, more X-Men. We've got two huge X-Men 90s crossover books here. So this one is Fatal Attractions. Gosh, I have a lot of memories of this era. So you need to know that this book is not just the Fatal Attractions crossover, which was really just a series of single issues in each of the X-Men titles, but it collects the entire period in Uncanny X-Men and X-Factor, and then the single issues in X-Force, X-Men, Wolverine, and Excalibur. Fatal Attractions was largely themed around the return of Magneto. We had thought he'd gone down with the ship at the end of X-Men 3 in 1991. The ship, of course, being his asteroid M, which breaks apart and crashes to Earth. We all think he's dead. Or I guess part of it crashes to Earth, because certainly part of it's still in orbit here. But it turns out that he's still alive, and he has been gathering acolytes back to him. We see this in Uncanny X-Men 299 or 300, and we're like, wow, Magneto's still out there somewhere. And then he has a series of conflicts with the X-Men, which really come to a head in Uncanny X-Men 304 when Illyana Rasputin, Colossus' little sister, had been magic, finally succumbs to the legacy virus, which had actually, finally I say, it had only been released, like as we just talked about a few episodes ago, about 7 issues earlier at the end of Executioner's Song, and Magneto comes to the funeral and he's like, Are you really trusting Xavier with this future? Are you, you know, you just watched this girl die. Are you not going to, like, take a greater hand in your fate? And Colossus famously defects. He's the most boring X-Men, so why not give him up to be an acolyte? And that is what happens, that storyline, but there's also things that are related to that in the other books. Not so much X-Factor. I mean, they try to tie it into the acolytes, but it's not as strongly tied. But there's this thread of like breaking into Asteroid M after that, and maybe finally doing the thing that Xavier had never previously been willing to do, which is assassinate Magneto. And that famously in X-Men 25 leads to Wolverine losing the adamantium from his skeleton, which shows that there were claws underneath this whole time, which is like a major mind-blowing moment. So I have some fond memories of some of this material, but in retrospect, having read a lot of this when this book came out, my fond memories are more from Adjectiveless X-Men, the X-Men title that launched in 1991, and that's because that was drawn at the time by Andy Kubert and had Gambit and Rogue in it, especially in issue 24, which is like their famous actual first date, which feels like it should be in this book, because it collects the gap from Executioner's Song to the Fatal Attraction material in all of the other issues, but it doesn't collect that gap from X-Men. So like I remember being like a little disappointed in that way by this book, thinking like, well, why did they collect the gap everywhere else and not that one? The other thing is those books had holographs on their cover, but they weren't full-on holographic covers. They were like a trading card size holograph that was actually mounted on the cover, which actually was a pain in the butt because it like caught on your comic bags and it just like wasn't even that interesting. And so I remember at the time on X Factor 92 in specific, I pulled the holograph card off of the book because I just wanted to see what the art was underneath. Then, of course, after having done that, I had second thoughts about why I did it, and I decided I wanted to put it back on the book, and of course that proved impossible. So I actually had to go out and get a second copy of the book so I could have one that had the holograph on it, and so that is the story of why I have 2 copies of X Factor 92. I'm explaining this because I'm actually trying to find one of the issues here that has the hologram on it because I want to show you if they scanned in the art. And here's what they did. I think this is so silly when they do this. They, instead of actually working from camera readies of the cover art, they're clearly just scanning in the cover art of an actual issue. And that includes the holograph, which doesn't even look right because you can't scan it. And so it's just this like blurry mess on the page, even though the rest of the cover has been cleaned up pretty well for modern colors. This is like doubly flummoxing to me because A, oh my gosh, if you don't have the art file, like, how do you not have the art file, I guess, is A. And then B, especially for a cover like this where it's not on holographic paper, but it's a card that could be easily pried off, pry it the hell off the cover and scan the full cover art. Oh my gosh, it just blows my mind. So there's very rarely is this the case in omnibuses because usually it's either that like the whole cover was on some kind of like holographic foily paper or not. And so and sometimes it's just like a strip of a holograph embedded or debossed into the paper. And sometimes they can replace that with a solid color, which actually brings us to this next book, Phalanx Covenant. These books all had a strip of holograph on their covers, and I'm almost positive that in the versions that are in this book, oh no, they did scan it with holograph. Even though the newsstand, not holograph versions, which are readily available, just had a red stripe there, and Marvel could have easily scanned those in. So, you know, this is where I start to get like a little annoyed. We're paying all this money for these books. This book here, which is a smaller one, was $75, and Fatal Attractions was $100. And we're getting books with like lazy restoration. In the case of Fatal Attractions, somebody went in all through the trouble of scanning and retouching that cover, only not to pry the holograph off. And in this book, they're scanning holographic paper, which doesn't even read to a scanner, instead of, oh, here on the cover it's like this, instead of having the red stripe, which is the way that you could get it on the newsstand, I believe, for the newsstand copies. And if you look in the interiors of these books, sometimes the digital retouch of the images is pretty good, but there's other times when it uses more gradient that you can kind of like see the paper quality a little bit underneath the scan, and which indicates to me that they're really just scanning these off of issues and then cleaning them up, because so many of them were like in the early stages of digital coloring that they can't even open up the files anymore, even if they were to have them, and the original art has long since been sold. So this is really the state of collecting any kind of comic from the 90s. I mean, coming up in a couple of months is this Wildcats Absolute Edition, which at the time Wildcats had some of the most state-of-the-art computer coloring in the entire industry as one of the early books for Image. And so you'd think, wow, well that should just look good in a collection, right? Except for how many files do you have from 1992 that you not only still have the digital file, but that you can open on your current computer? I have floppy disks from my 1997 computer, and not only do I have nothing today that can read a floppy disk, but even if you got a USB floppy drive, I don't have any of the programs that could read any of those files on the computer anyway. So a lot of these files, even if some computer gets hunted down, which can crack open the file, a lot of the coloring and things are not going to persist, and effectively they have to get rebuilt. So is it really the coward's way out for Marvel to be scanning from paper copies of the book and then retouching on screen to get it to look as close to the paper copy? It actually might have been much harder to do it the Image way and actually recolor the things from files, or actually like rebuild them from black and white art. So I can only complain too much, but I do think it stinks of laziness a little bit if they're doing the scanning route and don't even start with a good scan. But back to Phalanx Covenant here. Now this is one of the books that really just collects a crossover, except for it collects a few additional issues of Uncanny X-Men, 306, 311, and 314, and then skips 315 and has 316 and 317. 315 is actually in Fatal Attractions, but there is no, I don't think at this time, oversized collection of, let's see, what would that be? 307 through 310. This was an interesting crossover in that it was kind of like introducing new or revised characters in every issue and presenting that the Phalanx, who was a techno-organic species of whom Warlock of the New Mutants is an example, were coming to Earth and planning to, I guess, like take over all the mutants. I don't quite remember all of the details there, but that ultimately these mutants that they save from them causes Xavier to open up the school once again, which had been vacant since the New Mutants had departed to form X-Force, and it becomes actually not Xavier's school itself, but the Massachusetts school, which had been Emma Frost's school where the Hellions lived. Of course, they had been massacred actually in Bishop's Crossing, which we saw a few-ish episodes ago in X-Men 281, and they do Generation X in that school with Emma Frost and Banshee as the twin headmasters, and the cast that included characters like Jubilee, Husk, Chamber, Sink, Skin, Penance, and I'm sure I probably missed one in there. This does not have Generation X #1 in it, although the paperback collection of this at some point, even if it hadn't been named this exact thing, did have Generation X #1 in it. And Generation X has never been in a oversized hardcover, those initial issues. So that feels like a little bit of a drop ball. Since this is not that big, it feels like maybe it could have collected Generation X 1 through 4, which at that point had been interrupted by Age of Apocalypse, and then we would be right to the Age of Apocalypse omnibus. In the same way that it's weird that it has that little gap of issues in Uncanny X-Men, again, for a book that's this slim. But, you know, I guess somebody at the X-Men collection department must be doing some kind of planning. So even if they're getting the things wrong with all of these scans, hopefully they're getting it right with the mapping, and one day, far in the future, our children's children will have a complete oversized hardcover shelf of X-Men, although by that point they'll probably have started collecting it in some kind of like 3G projection that you could walk around in and experience, and then we'll have to rebuy them all over again. So, should you buy these books? Hard to say. I will say that the paperback version of Fatal Attractions, which is actually pretty recent, does not collect all the same issues of this book. It just collects the crossover and a few additional issues. It does not have the full runs in here. I don't know. You've got to really love 90s X-Men, and all the really formative events of 90s X-Men have like happened through Bishop's Crossing and then Executioner's Song. So I think you only really go after these if you really have already got those, or if you love Generation X so much, then you probably want Phalanx Covenant. I don't even know that Fatal Attractions is that great of a Magneto story ultimately, although it does kind of set up the end of Magneto until he's brought back shortly before Grant Morrison's run during the Magneto War arc in X-Men, which has only to this point been collected in paperback. Gosh, I really can run on when it gets to this 90s X-Men stuff because I know a lot about it. But here is the ceremonial shelving of Fatal Attractions and the Phalanx Covenant. We have a whole X-Men shelf that's developed down here over the last couple of episodes. Thanks so much for tuning in and watching another episode of Crushing Comics. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, only 7 squares left in the shelf until my collection is completely unpacked, so please keep tuning in as we fall in love with my comic book collection. For me, all over again, for you, the first time. Thanks again.